Welcome to Theorising Social Life. This is your fourth lecture in this module, and today we are going to start looking at some to feminist theory. At least we will when the slides change. So part of what we're going to look at will be the background to the various different types of feminist theory, and considering the issues of whether different social institutions undergo a feminizing process, and I'll explain what that means in a second. In fact, I'll explain it now. So when we're talking about the notion of feminizing an institution or feminizing theory, partly this flashes back to earlier decades in sociology, when the vast majority of qualified sociologists, lecturers, writers, authors, researchers, what have you, were men. And so they tended to focus on issues that were of primary concern to themselves. And it's also worth noting that they weren't, if we're thinking in terms of demographics, not simply men, but also specifically middle-class men. That they came from a particular social background, a particular part of the world, and understood the world from that perspective. So, for example, Karl Marx, obviously a man, focused his main interest on understanding employment in the workplace. And whilst there certainly were plenty of working class women in jobs, he mostly described it in terms of the kind of workplaces that men worked in. And so thought of it from a more male point of view than a female point of view, or indeed a balanced point of view. That gradually began to change as more women became involved in sociology, became students on courses, and then qualified and took up jobs in research posts and lecturing jobs in universities, and started writing books and on the subject and all sorts of things like that. And so gradually the female presence in sociology became more prominent, to the point where, as you'll know from your own experiences, that the majority of students undertaking the study of sociology these days are female, and that seems to be replicated across most countries, that by and large it is women who study sociology much more so than men who study sociology. And so increasingly the graduates, the qualified graduates, are more and more women, less and less men. And so the people lecturing, researching, writing books are the numbers, the ratio between men and women is increasing decade on decade, with higher numbers of women and smaller numbers of men. Does this lead to a change in focus? Well, certainly a lot of those early women who were qualifying in sociology and studying and writing books and teaching it and so on, one of the things they did was to shift the areas of focus, to say that the kinds of things that were of interest to male sociologists of previous generations in areas of study were not of very much interest to them. They were more interested in other issues. And so not only did it lead to a change in personnel, but it led to a change in the kinds of topics being looked into, researched, studied. So in the early days, this was sort of looking at housework, looking at motherhood, looking at child care and child rearing, looking at women's experiences in the workplace, looking at issues of sexual harassment, issues around dieting, issues around body image. And whilst there are certainly men who get sexually harassed and men who have body image problems, it has majoritively been seen as a more female issue, and certainly not something that many male sociologists, at that time at least, were interested in looking at. And so we've got this kind of shift in people and shift in topics, areas of research, and arguably a shift in the underpinning philosophies of research, not only what to study but how to study it, and a growth in greater numbers towards qualitative research rather than quantitative research. Is this therefore to be understood as a more feminizing process? Now, Judith Butler, who is a very prominent person in the realm of gender studies, has suggested that feminization is less about straightforward biology. It's not solely to do with having a woman's body, but it's more and more to do with an act, a way of behaving, a way of looking, a way of dressing, a way of speaking, a way of what she terms performing in the world. That feminizing, so a man can feminize, or indeed a woman can feminize, become more like the expected stereotype of femininity within a given culture, just as equally in the opposite direction somebody can masculinize and become more like the expected stereotype of masculinity in the culture. So it's less rooted in biology, she says, than in performed behaviour. And anyone as such can learn to perform a certain type of behaviour with greater or lesser success. So this is something we can discuss in the chat, in the virtual classroom, as to whether you feel the move towards larger and larger numbers of women, is it changing sociology? Is it shifting the focus, or does it make no real difference to the kind of topics studied, or the ways they're studied, or the views expressed? Maybe you think it makes a big difference, maybe you think it makes no difference. And if you think it makes a difference, you might see that as a very positive difference, you might see it as a very negative difference, or you might see it as some sort of somewhere between the two, of having both good and bad elements to it. Having said the early names in sociology were mostly men, the emphasis there is on the word mostly. There were certainly women who were early lights, and the lady in the picture here, Harriet Martineau, is an example of a very early female sociologist and female thinker who wrote books and expressed her opinions on various different areas and issues, but unfortunately didn't lead to a mass change in educational policy, because at the period in history where she was alive, whilst she came from a very wealthy background and that enabled her to get an education, the vast majority of women did not come from very wealthy backgrounds, and so there was still a lot of resistance towards women at all levels of society, working class, middle and upper class, having an education, let alone an education specifically in sociology. And the growing understanding of academic studies of society and mass movements and political movements in society. Is there such a thing as more male approaches to sociology and more female approaches to sociology, or is that a very old-fashioned way of thinking? Something to discuss in the virtual classroom. So we'll go back more to laying some basics and revisiting ideas from first year, reinforcing them, deepening them a little bit. Feminist theory per se begins as a study of the status of women, and by extension of men, of course, in society, but primarily the status of women, and comes at it from a loosely Marxist approach, in that Marx's prescription for sociology was that it should not simply describe society in a dry academic way, but that it should seek to better, improve, change, revolutionise society. And so almost all feminist theory is not simply a matter of describing the way the world is, but of recommending ways to change the world. And, at least in theory, change it for the better. I mean, you might argue the relative merits of one idea for change versus another idea for change. But in the minds of the people proposing the changes, even if not everyone agrees with them, they will regard their proposals as being ones that would improve society, make it fairer and more balanced, make the lives of women better, and potentially the lives of men better, for that matter. So there is this exploration of what it is to be a woman in society, particularly bearing in mind that for large swathes of time very little attention was given to what it was like to be a woman, or at least at an academic level. I'm sure people had lots and lots of discussions with each other round the kitchen table and that sort of thing, but very little was ever committed to writing in books, very little considered to be of significant interest. So whilst there were some very significant influential women, like Aphra Behn, for example, they are fairly few and far between, whereas there's much larger numbers of very influential men who were not consciously saying, I'm going to write about men, but rather they just by default, that was their area of focus, their area of experience. Equally, we might say, and increasingly many people do suggest, that there are other areas of neglect and imbalance, that an awful lot of sociologists are usually white Europeans or white Americans or white Australians, and only in fairly recent times have sociologists from Africa, from China, from India, from Malaysia, from various other countries around the world, where most people are not white, they are of some other a different ethnicity. Only in fairly recent times has the ethnic diversity of sociology come to prominence and the fore. And so, again, just as a female sociologist may have a different point of view from a male sociologist, different lived experience, does a black or an Asian or a Southeast Asian sociologist have a very different experience and opinion from a white European one? A matter for discussion. Other people make similar comparisons between straight and gay sociologists and bisexual sociologists and so on, in that the majority, as far as anyone knows at least, the majority of sociologists from earlier decades were mainly heterosexual, and that the number of openly gay or bisexual sociologists where their sexual orientation was known about by a wider audience have come to the fore in recent years. And just as female sociologists have shifted the focus of what kinds of subjects to study, so once upon a time nobody would have thought about studying the lives of gay men or the lives of lesbians and things that were of particular relevance to those groups of people, whereas nowadays there are, if not massive numbers, at least fairly large numbers of people saying, yes, let's go and study this subject, let's go and study that subject, let's find out about this type of person or that type of person's lived experience, what it is like to be them. So does having these more varied, more diverse opinions and approaches open up whole new worlds of social study and exploration that are worthwhile and beneficial? Or are we, as some people have suggested, perhaps stereotyping, limiting, assuming that somehow a female sociologist or a black sociologist or a gay sociologist will definitely think in a totally different way to a male or a white or a straight sociologist, as if somehow not putting somebody in one box means they think radically different from somebody who's been stuck in a different box. Is that stereotyping, or is that an appreciation of actual lived experience? There are opinions on both sides of that approach, and it'd be interesting to hear your opinions on this one. But putting aside the issues around different ethnicities and different sexualities, for the moment at least, we'll come back to feminism. We have four main waves. There is an argument that there is now a fifth wave, but that argument is not a wholly clear-cut one, in that some people say yes there is and other people say no there isn't. So we're going to leave the fifth wave aside for the moment at least. Perhaps add it to the lecture in future years when there's a more definitive view upon the matter. But there are what's regarded as four waves of feminism in existence. These waves are tied to particular historical periods, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they only existed in a specific period of time. So you can still have someone in 2020 who would class themselves as a second wave or a third wave feminist, for example. Not too many would class themselves as first wave, but perhaps there are. So first wave feminism is when feminism began, really. And although it says 19th and 20th century there, you can find examples of feminist thinking in the 18th and indeed in the 17th century and earlier. It's just rarer to find. The further back in time you go, the more sporadic, the more isolated the examples become. So really, once we get into the Victorian period, we see the suffragist and the suffragette movement kicking off. Now, in the first year you would have covered the differences between suffragist and suffragette, but just in case you've forgotten that over the summer, we'll have a very brief recap. The suffragist movement consisted of women and men who wanted to change the legal status of women, to get them the vote, for example, get them the franchise, but to do so by peaceful methods, like signing petitions, writing letters to politicians, going on peaceful marches, that sort of thing. The suffragettes were, again, mostly women, some men as well, who felt that the suffragist movement was taking too long to make changes, that the government simply wasn't listening to the suffragist movement, and that therefore they needed to step it up a bit and engage in the kinds of protests that would draw attention. And so more vocal, more noisy protests and demonstrations, also things like smashing windows of shops, putting small bombs, explosive devices in pillar boxes. On one occasion, a bomb was put into the house of a politician, but that was before the politician had moved into the house. So the house, as far as the person putting the bomb there knew, was empty. And so it wasn't an attempt to murder anyone, it was an attempt to blow up empty property. And famously, someone throwing themselves before the king's horse at a horse race, and she died in the process, but there is some dispute as to whether she intended to die or whether in fact she was trying to hand a banner to the jockey, and the death was an accident rather than a sort of self-sacrifice. There was some uncertainty about her death, but that's an example of the first wave. So the focus there was on chiefly getting the vote for women. Also some pressures around better standards at work for working class women, better levels of pay, and so forth, because women generally were paid less than men, even though they were doing identical work, because the law allowed it as a possibility. The usual assumption being that the man was the main breadwinner, and that therefore women didn't need to earn as much money. So it was partly a pressure for equal pay, but a primary focus on getting the vote as the chief issue that was at play there. And some other aspects as well, so things like women's rights to see their children in the aftermath of a divorce, because earlier laws, before a lady called Caroline Morton came along and shook the whole process up, earlier laws meant that if a couple got divorced, which was very rare, but if they did get divorced, then the man had automatic custody of the children, and the woman, the mother, had no rights to see the child unless the man allowed it through his own choice. So if it was the kind of ex-husband who said, "No, you're never seeing your children again," then there was no legal recourse for the estranged mother, the estranged wife. There was nothing much she could do about it. She could keep writing letters to her husband saying, "Please let me see the kids," but if he said no, then that was it. So that was the focus of the first wave. The second wave emerged in the middle part of the 20th century. So that the vote had been achieved, the franchise had been achieved for women, and divorce rights had been improved for women, access to children and custody issues had begun to be improved for women. The second wave was interested in more workplace issues, so not only equal pay for women, but also gaining access for women to a different array of jobs. Some of that overlapped with the first wave. So, for example, the press for women to be able to matriculate from the university. So there were some universities where women could study, but they weren't allowed to graduate. And so, having completed their studies, they didn't have a certificate that would help them to get particular types of jobs, because by and large those jobs were not available for women to take up. So the press there for both the first wave and the second wave was to not only improve women's educational opportunities, but to press for them to have access to certain types of careers. We're chiefly talking about the middle-class professional careers here, which previously they had not had access to. Women have always worked. In working class women we're talking about here, in manual jobs and on farms and things like that. But middle class women were denied access to the kinds of professions that their husbands had. and so there was the push there. And gradually also, of course, once women got the vote, the push that they could not only cast their votes, but that they would also be allowed to stand for election. And that started to happen in the early 20th century as we begin that gradual shift from first wave into second wave feminism. The pill is invented around the period of this, and again, would second wave feminism have happened if the pill had not been invented? That's a question often asked, and the answer may well be no. The two may go hand in glove together. So having control of fertility, being able to choose how many children you do or don't have, having rights over your own body, because again, some countries obviously deny women the right to go on the pill or have abortions or control their fertility in other respects, like having sterilisation operations and that sort of thing. So there's different countries approach it differently, and there was a push for women chiefly during the second wave to gain control in law over their own bodies in respect primarily to fertility issues as much as anything else. Now, gender essentialism, if you're unfamiliar with that term or you've forgotten it over the course of the summer, is the idea that to be a woman, and equally to be a man, is a biological thing. So a woman is born a woman, which may seem an odd thing to say, but obviously the way things are viewed in 2020 is a bit different from the way they were viewed in 1960. And that because you're born a woman, you're born with ovaries and a womb and all the rest of it, you experience things as a woman that a man will never experience, and vice versa. So there is a biological basis to being a man or a biological basis to being a woman. And the other sex will not experience exactly the same things. They may experience some similar things, but not exactly the same things. So a man cannot know what it's like to menstruate or to give birth. A woman won't know what it's like to have prostate problems or, to be a little bit crass, have an erection. There's all sorts of things about male biology unknown to women and vice versa. So the notion that a person is their womanhood or their manhood is essential to their core nature and rooted in their biology is a central teaching of the second wave of feminism. As we move into the third wave, once we're getting into the 1990s really, then a very different point of view comes about, and that is gender constructivism. Now, gender constructivism says that gender is defined. It's not innate to biology. And it began earlier on, it began in the 60s, although it didn't really culminate until the 90s, but with the writings of Simone de Beauvoir, who was a French sociologist who wrote a number of books in the 60s, and later as well, but had a huge influence. And one of her famous quotes is that you are born a woman, but you learn to be a lady. And so you learn how to dress, you learn how to walk in high heels or whatever the fashion is of the day. You learn mannerisms, gestures, you learn ways to perform being a woman, to be ladylike. And equally you can make the argument men learn ways to perform being masculine, to be manly, to be gentlemanly, how to dress, how to walk, how to talk, all the rest of it. So these are learnt, taught experiences. At least that was Simone de Beauvoir's view. And by extension, a view that she herself was not particularly arguing, but which people who read her and were influenced by her and followed on with their own research and their own books later on, did argue, is that it's not rooted in biology. Therefore, someone who is biologically male could learn to perform in a female way, and someone who is biologically female could learn to perform in a male way. So it's a learned behaviour, like an act, essentially. And certainly Judith Butler is very much rooted in this perception. And she talks about gender as a performance, something you perform like an actor performs a role in the theatre. You put on a costume, you walk on the stage, you perform your role. And just as you don't have to be a real-life murderer to play the role of a murderer in a stage play, so you don't have to be biologically something in order to perform the role of it. It's a learned thing. She was chiefly thinking in terms of gender, but other people have taken that idea and applied it in other areas, which we'll talk about as we go along. Womanism, if you're unfamiliar with the term, is a title that was developed again in the 90s to suggest that black women, and by extension Asian women, Southeast Asian women from China, Japan, those sorts of countries, they experience feminism in a very different way from white women. And so that led to some women from those ethnic backgrounds saying that rather than call themselves feminism, which they saw as a mainly white woman's thing, they would use the term womanism to convey still the same idea of being focused on female rights and so on, but from a primarily ethnic point of view rather than a white woman's point of view. We also see the development of intersectionality, which is the growing awareness, kind of hand in glove with womanism, that people have lots of different of identities. They have a gender identity, they have an ethnic identity, a national identity, their social class identity, an identity rooted perhaps in their sexuality, and that all of these things intersect with each other and overlap each other and interact with each other. So there is a sort of a movement between different forms of identity, and this comes to more prominence in the 90s and in the early 2000s than it had in previous eras, which doesn't mean necessarily that no one was thinking about gay identity and things like that in the 1960s or 70s, just that it became much more of a prominent thing in the 90s with the third wave. And a lot of people would still class themselves as third wave, but also equally for that matter, a lot of people would still class themselves as second wave. We can see an example of conflicts in this area going on if, for example, we take Germaine Greer. Now, Germaine Greer wrote a number of the defining texts of second wave feminism. And she takes the approach that to be a woman is biologically essential. You have to be born with a woman's body, and that's the experience of being a woman. And that there is a very kind of physicality to being a woman. There's also the social role, and she's not denying that the way women dress in one period of history is very different from another, and so that kind of cultural, what one country or one period of history considers ladylike is very different from another country or another period of history. She's not denying any of that, but she is saying that there is a centrality to human biology in the experience of being a woman, or by extension of being a man. So up until a few years ago, she sat on the governing board as both a lecturer and a member of the board of an all-female college in this country. At one point, that college received a job application from a transgendered lecturer, that is to say, someone who had been born in a male body but identified as a woman, and I believe had had surgery and hormone injections and so on, and was living as a woman. And the board who dealt with job applications raised the question with the wider board of the college: can we consider this application? Because normally it was not only for all female students, but for all female staff as well at the college. And this led to a bit of a rift between the board members, because some of them were, like Germaine Greer, second wave, who said, no, we can only have applications and employment, we can only employ biological women in this role because this is a women's college. And other members of the board were more third wave, and they said, well, if this person identifies as a woman, lives as a woman, they are a woman, and regardless of what genitalia they may have been born with, they are a woman because they identify as one, therefore we have to consider them for employment. And this spilled out onto the internet, as everything does these days, and led to a lot of very vocal opinions in both directions from all sorts of people who weren't part of the college and had nothing to do with the college, but as is the way of the internet, everyone seems to think they've got the right to chip in their two pennyth worth on every subject under the sun. So there was a lot of vocal voices in both directions for and against this argument. The upshot of the dispute was that the person applying for the job got it, and Germaine Greer resigned from her position on the board. That I won't go into who was right and who was wrong, because that's very much a matter of personal opinion, and I dare say you'll have your own views, some of you in one way and some of you in the other way. But it's an example of a dispute between two types of feminists, between the second wave gender essentialist feminists and between the third wave gender constructivist feminists, in terms of how gender, womanhood, manhood is understood in the first place. What actually is it? Is it a performed social role which is constructed by society, or is it something very much rooted in biology? Very strong views in both directions. Some of you may be familiar with the term TERF, T-E-R-F. Others of you may not have heard that term before. It's a term of insult, really, that is used by third wave feminists against second wave feminists, and the letters stand for trans exclusionary radical feminist, because the second wave feminists, some of whom did indeed identify as radical feminists, but not all did, are nowadays, whether they identify as radical feminists or not, often have that label of being called radical feminists by people who disagree with their views on the issue of transgender, as to whether a transgender person is fully a member of the sex they identify with, or whether it should be understood in a very different light. And so it's quite a contentious sort of an issue that leads to a lot of disputes. Come round about 2012, give or take, we see the beginnings of fourth wave feminism, so it's still in its very early days as a phenomena, and is developing, so it's a little bit difficult to define because it is developing as we speak. But it's seen chiefly as a form of feminism which is heavily based in social media and activism through social media, rather than through more traditional routes of walking the streets, waving a placard, going on protest movements, protest marches, all that sort of thing. The more, shall we say, real world style of protest, whereas this is more virtual world style of protest, and tends to pick up on more issues of daily life. So to give you an example, where the first wave of feminism was about getting the vote for women and getting parity of pay for working class women and so on, the kind of thing that gets talked about a lot on social media within the fourth wave movement includes things like manspreading, men taking up too much space on buses and trains by spreading their legs wide. And is that an imposition on female passengers? I mean, you could argue it's an imposition just as much on other male passengers, but the perception that this is more of a kind of a male power thing and is directed against women rather than against every other passenger on the transport. How is manspreading to be understood? And so it's obviously, compared to the issue of whether or not you have the rights to see your own children, it's a fairly minor thing. But it's seeing the idea that as the major challenges to women in previous centuries are being dealt with and tackled and overcome, so the focus on issues is moving to more kind of day-to-day stuff rather than the big issues that people were dealing with in the 1800s. There is a website called Everyday Feminism Project, which, if you wanted, you could look at that, Google it, look it up, and look at some of the issues that they talk about there. It tends to be very much concerned with things like intersectionality. So again, there is overlap between the waves to a point, but taking it in somewhat different directions. The Me Too movement, hashtag Me Too, is an example of a fourth wave movement, because it was very much geared towards tackling a perceived issue through social media rather than through other routes. So to give you an example of that, when we have the classroom chat tomorrow, we can discuss these waves if there's any aspects of it that is unclear or you want to delve into a bit more deeply. We can do that then. At some point, there will probably be a fifth and a sixth and a seventh wave, but that's in the future, and who knows what they might be. Alongside these waves, there are also four major schools or types of feminism. These types overlap with the different waves, so they kind of weave between them, if you see what I mean, rather than being singularly attached with only one wave. So you've got liberal, radical, Marxist and postmodernist forms of feminism. There are other schools, but these tend to be the big four, and the other ones are less popular. Not as many women or indeed men who subscribe to them as subscribe to these four schools. So these are the four we'll focus on. But if you are interested in one of the less well-known schools of feminism, that's something we can talk about in class and so on, and discuss that way. So to go over the big four and how they're understood and what they focus on, liberal feminism was, if you like, the very early form of feminism. It's the kind that was around in the Victorian and Edwardian age. Not normally called feminism at that point of history. This is at that stage called the suffragist and suffragette movement, but that was chiefly liberal in its focus and nature. So the the area of focus within liberal feminism is mainly in terms of gaining equality to men, where men have a better deal in some area of life than women do. So if men are being paid more per hour or per week, per month, however often, for doing a particular type of job, and women do the same job but get less money for it, then the goal of liberal feminism is to ensure that women and men get paid the same amount for doing that job. Likewise, if men have certain rights over their children, then women should have comparable rights over their children. If men are able to instigate divorce, women should be able to instigate divorce. So if there is a legal status, political status for men in some capacity, women should have the same or at least very similar status. And there will be certain issues around biology, coming back to the essentialist issue, which are quite specific to one sex or another, which there would be perhaps no direct equivalent argument to be made for the other sex, but it's about gaining a sense of control, a sense of equality, a sense of fairness. So it's not about massively overhauling society 100%. It's society per se retains much the same structure it has, but the position of women goes up a notch in a given society. And obviously you could be looking at any society around the world and make these arguments about it. So that tends to be the focus. And usually through the methods of achieving change are by and large more peaceful. Political campaign rather than lobbing bricks through windows. It tends to be a more peaceful approach to achieving these forms of campaign, through educating people, convincing them, getting them on side, changing their minds, drawing them into the movement that way. So the focus is on rationality, the assumption that everyone is, well, I say everybody, the vast majority of people are rational, capable. Obviously you do have to factor in issues of severe mental illness and severe mental incapacity, but by and large most people are rational and are as capable as each other. That rationality is not influenced by such issues as well, predominantly gender in this case, but equally you can make the same arguments around racial issues and so on. So there is a kind of liberal approach to racial matters as well as a liberal approach to feminist matters and sexism and so forth. The counter arguments here, in the sense of how these arguments around rationality come about, is that there are cultures around the world, and you can look at some of the debates that go on, for example, in Saudi Arabia, about whether women are rational or irrational beings. Are they capable of voting, or are they too irrational, too silly to vote? That was an argument that went on in this country in the Victorian age, and is still going on in Saudi Arabia, where they've only recently allowed women to drive cars, but they have to have a man in the car with them whilst they're driving. And the concern over that was that women would be too easily distracted by cars and driving and wouldn't be able to do it very well, and they would cause accidents. And also the concern that where would they drive to? Would they go off and do naughty things and untoward things? And so that sense that women were not quite as functional as men. And there's quite a lot of societies at different points in history that have argued that, just as there are lots of societies at points in history that have argued one ethnic group is not as sensible or rational or capable as another ethnic group. That this or that ethnic group is sort of more simplistic in their thinking than some other ethnic group is, and therefore the law has to treat them differently. Whereas liberal feminism says, no, it doesn't matter if you're a male or female, and by extension black, white, Asian, etc., etc. You're all capable of thinking to the same standard, therefore the law should treat you equally. Both in terms of how it supports people, gives them opportunities, but equally there should be fair treatment if someone has broken the law. So if a man and a woman break the same law, commit the same crime, they should get the same punishment. One should not get a much severer punishment than the other merely because of their gender. They should both be treated in an equal way, in both given good opportunities, but also when they do things wrong, they should be treated in an equal way. And we are all capable of making rational decisions. It's partly related to rational choice theory, which is something we'll talk about more in a future class. You might want to pause the video at this point, get yourself a coffee and think about these issues, and we can discuss them in the class chat when we meet up tomorrow. What would equality mean in these different areas? And you'll perhaps have your own views on this. But I'll give you an example of what we could mean, or how we could approach this subject. So if we're saying equality in terms of pay, so let's say this would be illegal at the moment, but let's pretend for the moment it was happening. So let's say you've got a business, and it employs Mary and it employs Fred to do exactly the same job. They're both employed to stack shelves in a supermarket, for argument's sake. And Fred gets paid 10 quid an hour to stack shelves in a supermarket, and Mary gets paid 5 quid an hour to stack shelves in a supermarket. Clearly that is unequal, and these days it's also illegal, but let's put that to one side. What would equality mean? Now there's at least 3 forms of equality that could be employed here. Now you could say, pay them both 10 quid an hour, so Mary gets a pay rise. That's equality. You could say, pay them both 5 quid an hour, so Fred's wage drops by half, but then they're still both equal. They're still both being paid the same amount, it's just not a very good amount. Or you could meet somewhere in the middle and say, pay them both £7.50 an hour, so Mary's wage goes up a little bit, Fred's wage goes down a little bit, and they meet in the middle. All 3 of those would be a form of equality. Obviously, some forms of equality will put a much bigger smile on Mary's face than other forms, and some forms of equality would put a much bigger scowl on Fred's face than other forms of equality would. So when we say, we want equality for so-and-so thing, what actually does that mean? How will we evaluate and assess and know we've got equality? Because equality can be understood in a variety of different ways, and some forms of equality are more desirable than others. I'm sure most people would want to be paid the 10 quid an hour than the 5 quid or the £7.50 quid an hour. So although all 3 are a form of equality, some obviously are more advantageous forms than other forms are. So what do we mean by that? But I'll leave you to think about it, mull it over now, and then you'll have some ideas in the back of your head to discuss when we meet up in the virtual classroom to chat about these things. Radical feminism was much more prominent in the late 60s and 70s than it is today, although there are still radical feminists around. There are just not quite as many of them as there were going back a few decades now. Radical feminism even took the approach that the whole of society was patriarchal, and therefore in order to achieve equality and change the problems in society, the whole of society had to in effect be torn down and rebuilt. Now, what do we mean by patriarchy? As an anthropological term, it literally translates as rulership by the fathers. So in societies, some societies at any rate, older, mature men who are usually fathers, not always, but usually fathers, have the say. In a given family, the father will be the head of the household, and so if the son or the daughter wants to get married, they need dad's permission to get married, and if he refuses it, well, tough luck, they can't get married. That's patriarchy. He controls the house. And by extension, you go up from the level of the household to the level of government, that it will be a man who is the king or the prime minister or the president or whatever title he is called by, and he will be the father figure of the nation, and he will be the one in control, and therefore women don't get into positions of authority, and equally younger men don't tend to get into positions of authority, because it's the older fatherly men who gain the positions of authority. That's the literal meaning within anthropology. As a word that gets bandied around endlessly today, does it still mean quite the same thing? Because by and large, when the term patriarchy is used today, it tends not to mean specifically fathers, but just men in general, whether they're fathers or whether they're not, and regardless of what age they are. So it's kind of changed in the context in which it is used. Now, clearly, we do not live in 21st century Britain in a society where your father owns you. If you are living at home with mum and dad, you do not need your father's permission to get married if you're over the age of 18, regardless of whether you're a young man or a young woman. You don't need your father's permission. You can go against what your father does or doesn't approve of. Certainly there are the families where, through sheer force of bullying, that may not be lived up to, but legally you don't require permission. Likewise, if you want to get a job, you want to earn money, you don't require your father's permission to do that. Your father has no rights of ownership over your money and your bank account once you're old enough to have a bank account. There's all sorts of things that fathers 200 years ago had in law, rights and powers in law, which they do not have anymore. And so in that sense, actually we don't live in a patriarchy anymore, in the anthropological sense, because we are no longer owned by our fathers. And of course women can be prime ministers. They, in this country, they can, well, the Queen is a woman, obviously, they can now join the church. You can have female bishops in positions of authority, Church of England at least, if not all churches. Women can run businesses, they can instigate divorce. There's all sorts of things that women can do now that they could not have done 200 years ago. So those feminists, and indeed people who are not feminists, who challenge and disagree with radical feminism, question this narrative of that whether or not we actually live in a patriarchy anymore in 21st century Britain. There are clearly parts of the world you could go to which are very, very patriarchal and haven't changed much at all over the course of the last 200 years. But there are plenty of other countries you can go to which have changed very significantly over the course of 200 years. So what do or do we not understand by the notion of patriarchy? People like Shulamith Firestone, who was a very forceful advocate of the radical feminist position, as well as actually the Marxist feminist position. So some people have a foot in several camps of feminism. She felt that society, that was going back to the 70s, was endemically male-dominated in every which way that was important that you could imagine, and that men would not willingly give up their power. Therefore, there had to be a real kind of ripping down of the social institutions in order to rebuild a brand new society in which women would have their freedom and their liberty and be valued and seen as equal and so on. And that to some extent, although radical feminism has never been overly concerned about the position of men, There are some feminists who point out that men also often don't do terribly well in society, and the suicide rate is much higher for men than for women. The injuries at work rate is massively higher for men than for women. There's a lot of jobs men do in very large numbers that are very smelly, unpleasant, dangerous jobs which hardly any women do. And so there's all sorts of ways in which men don't get much of a good deal. Far more men are homeless than women are homeless, for example. And the implication has been that if society is re-overhauled in this brand new way and it's made much more egalitarian and so on, men will find themselves faring better in that society than they do in the current society. So whilst that's not a specific goal of radical feminism, to make life better for men, it's a knock-on effect of making life better for women. Or at least that is the proposition. You may or may not agree with that. You may think that's a feasible reality, or you may think that is highly unlikely. I mean, you'll have, I'm sure, different opinions from different people in different directions. A major focus of radical feminism has also been the issue of sexual objectification, sort of adverts with half-naked women sprawling across cars and that sort of thing. The notion that women have to dress to please men rather than please themselves or please each other. The notion that sexual abuse is endemic, and there are people who challenge the statistics that are quoted on this. And this is something you do need to be very cautious of as we go forward, not just in this subject, but in all sorts of subjects, that there are lots of statistics in all sorts of areas that get bandied around, which, if you scrutinise them, don't bear much weight. So whenever anyone starts to quote statistics, look at those statistics. This is why we have the methodologies module, to get you to understand that statistics are very easy to manipulate and convey the impression they mean something which actually they don't, if you look at them in any great deal of detail. But rates of sexual violence is an area where statistics are often quoted around, and some of those statistics are horrifying, but also some of them don't bear too much scrutiny, just as statistics in lots of other areas don't bear too much scrutiny. So it's approaching the evidence with an open mind to how valid that evidence is. Look at it, explore it, examine it, consider it. But there are absolutely parts of the world where sexual abuse is incredibly common, and the women who get sexually abused are treated in a terribly, terribly shoddy way. Is that still the case in 21st century Britain? Or is it now much, much improved in Britain? Perhaps something we can get your opinions on that one when we're discussing in class. So some claims and views and ideas within radical feminism. The quote you've got up there from Sheila Smith Firestone: the end goal of feminist revolution must be, unlike that of the first feminist movement, in other words the first wave, not just the elimination of male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself. Genital differences between human beings would no longer matter culturally. Now this is a curiosity of an approach, in that this was certainly part of the gender essentialist argument back in the 60s and 70s. But the people who now often are very sceptical of the inclusion of transgender people within definitions of womanhood and manhood, even though they've had this idea in the past, don't necessarily follow it through to the particular conclusion it's taken now. Some do, some don't. So the argument that Firestone is making here is that her ideal society, her kind of utopia, future society, would be one in which the contents of someone's underwear would make no difference whatsoever to pretty much anything. What jobs you could get, what kind of education you could get, how much you get paid, walking down the street safely, all of that sort of thing. It wouldn't matter a damn what sort of genitals you had, you'd be treated in much the same way. Which is not quite the same thing as saying that somebody with a penis is a woman or somebody with a vagina is a man. But certainly that is the way it's interpreted within a lot of third wave feminism. So this is where you get the disputes going on between second and third wave feminism, what is the ultimate logical goal of this kind of sentiment, this kind of view? Where does it lead to? What's an acceptable outcome and what's unacceptable or missing the point, or however you want to phrase it and understand it. And we've already flagged up the question of what is patriarchy a bit, and that's something we can discuss in the chat when we get together. How do we understand male dominance, masculine dominance? Do you have to have 50% in every profession? So often there is a drive, for example, to say there should be more female company managers, more female MPs, more female leads in the films, that sort of thing. Often the focus being on the kind of more powerful, well-paid types of jobs. You don't often get people saying we should have more women dustmen, as whatever the word for a dustman is these days, a refuse collector or whatever the proper terminology is, that there should be more women working on dust carts, or more women working on sewage farms, or more women working in coal mines. You don't tend to get those arguments at the low-paid, filthy grottier end of the market. It tends to be mainly a focus on the better-paid jobs. So, to end male dominance, would you have to have 50% in every single job going, or just in the better-paid, higher-end jobs, and not so much in the lower-paid, kind of more manual, perhaps it's somewhat grubbier types of jobs? How do we understand this? What's being sought for? Something to think about. The notion of privilege is a very contentious one. It's a word that's bandied around 1,000 times a day now, on the internet at least. What constitutes privilege? The argument that if you're in some sections, some demographics, some groups, you will be treated in a way differently than if you were in another demographic group. That's not because you consciously make people treat you in that way. It's just a sort of deference, an assumption made about you because you're of a certain gender or a certain ethnicity or a certain social class by your accent, that kind of thing. Does this give you a privilege, or is this a hyperbole of the modern age and maybe doesn't bear too much scrutiny if it's looked at in any detail? Again, we can get your opinions on that. The goal there that is described in the quote is effectively a kind of an androgynous goal, getting people to the point, or society to the point, where biological sex would be an irrelevancy, something that you barely even notice. Is that a worthwhile goal, a viable goal? Is that a goal you'd like for yourself? Well, I say yourself, for your vision of future society? Or do you think that would be an awful thing and be a loss to society? What's your view, your opinion? A commonly made argument within radical feminism is that time and again the male body and male experiences are treated as the de facto norm in all sorts of ways. So something like thinking of arguments I've heard made in the past, the way seating is designed by engineers in, say, theatres or on airplanes, in trains and buses, that sort of thing. Is it designed more for the male anatomy or the female anatomy, or is it neutral? A common argument is that it is designed more for the male anatomy. Whether you agree or disagree on that one, we can discover in class. But the perception that the assumption is that what is the norm for men is the norm for everyone, rather than recognising that actually if you've got a different body or a different experience, the male options may not work out ideally for you. I could give you give you perhaps a rather silly example of this from my experience, not so much around the gender issue, but as an example of assumptions. Not being terribly tall myself, I find a lot of kitchen designs, even going into shops and shelving designs, quite often things are out of reach. It's not easy to get to. The assumption seems to be that most people are of a certain height, and if you're not of that height, then the world isn't always very convenient for you. It's not designed for you. So what is the norm, the assumption of the average body? the average height, the average weight, if we're thinking about chairs and their capacity to take weight and how broad the seat is, that kind of thing. There is, to a point at least, an assumption about the average person who will be using a particular thing, and therefore that thing is designed for them. Now, whether that's down to your height, your weight, your ethnicity, your gender, your this, your that, your the other, that is where we could get into ongoing discussions. A claim made within radical feminism is that there were people who identified and described themselves as, still are actually, political lesbians, which doesn't mean that they were lesbians who voted. It's not political in that sense. Rather, it was the idea that they were women who chose to be lesbians because they wanted to make a political statement about their solidarity with and love of other women. And if you contrast that as an idea to, say, the assumption that many people have, is it true, is it not, I don't know, but that's a lot of people believe it, that individuals are born gay or born straight or born bisexual, i.e. it's not a choice, you're just born that way, down to biological drivers and factors. The notion of political lesbianism is a rebuttal of the idea that your sexuality is something rooted in your biological drivers, that you are born a lesbian or you're born a gay man or a bisexual or a heterosexual. It's to effectively say, at least for lesbians, it is a choice. And that therefore there were women who maybe preferred men but were making the decision to be lesbians because that was their political statement, their affiliation to loving women and rejecting male power structures. It'd be interesting to hear your views, not just around lesbianism, but kind of sexuality in general, whether you see it as something that can be chosen, or whether you see it as something that is more biologically innate, or maybe a bit of both. Kind of get your views on that one and explore your ideas in those directions. Moving on to Marxist feminism. We have, well, pretty much what it says on the tin, feminism rooted in Marxist teachings and doctrines. Marx himself was not a feminist by any stretch of the imagination, but it's taking his ideas and putting them into a feminist context. So Marxist feminists stick with Marx's argument that there is a capitalist power structure which is designed by the super rich to keep them super rich and favour them not just in terms of how big their bank accounts are, but favour them in all sorts of other ways as well. And equally, not only to keep themselves rich, but to keep the poor poor. And so the whole of society is structured in that fashion. And they also stick with Marx's argument that to have a truly happy, free, smashing lovely society, that power structure must be torn down and replaced with a more balanced, non-capitalist system. With a communist or something else. Different people favour different words for what they'd like to replace the system with. They regard sexism, gender exploitation, the abuse of women and so on, as part and parcel of that capitalist structure, as a kind of a byproduct, you could almost put it, of capitalism itself. Going back to the period of history, in this country at least, when the majority of women were housewives and the husband went to work and the woman stayed at home and did all the domestic chores, looked after the kids and what have you, there was the notion that the woman would be there to look after the man, see to his needs, i.e. put a dinner on the table when he came back in and make sure his socks were washed and his shirts were ironed and all that palaver. And so if women were kind of downtrodden and put into a position of domestic drudgery, it was in order that the man would be able to work ridiculously long hours in a factory or a coal mine or wherever it was that he worked, and be there to support the super duper rich in sustaining their position at the top of the capitalist hierarchy. And so the man was repressed in terms of having to work ridiculously long hours at a back-breaking job and never seeing his, well, I say never, hardly ever seeing his wife and kids and just kind of work. And the woman was likewise chained to the kitchen sink to enable him to have the meal on the table when he got back, so that he could then be well fed just enough to go back to drudging at work the next day. A Marxist interpretation of domestic violence, which has caused a fair amount of controversy amongst non-Marxist feminists, is that if the husband gets really, really frustrated and fed up and is so overworked and exploited and underpaid and everything else, that he's filled with seething Marxist rage against the awfulness of the capitalist system, he can't, as such, lash out against those at the very top of society, because by and large he can't get to them. They've got too many bodyguards. Therefore, he will lash out at someone lower down the system, and he's more likely, in this interpretation, to lash out at his wife, to lash out at his kids, and also, of course, for that matter, to go down the pub, get drunk and beat up the bloke standing next to him at the pub who spills his pint. Therefore, domestic and street violence is seen as a byproduct of that kind of rage against the system that spills out of the downtrodden working man onto his nearest and dearest, or at least his nearest, if not always his dearest, because it can't be directed towards where it ought to go, which is also a somewhat Freudian interpretation of displacement, the displacement of rage and anger. Obviously, these days we don't quite live in that sort of 1950s wife at the kitchen sink and husband at work all day scenario, for most people at least. Women are just as likely to go out to work, and we also acknowledge increasingly these days that domestic violence is not always the man beating up his wife, that there are quite a lot of cases, in fact statistics suggest, and this again is a case where you need to have a good look at statistics and their validity, but they suggest that it's almost 50-50 in terms of the amount of men who hit their women versus their wives, versus the amount of women who hit their husbands, the men in their lives. It's roughly on a coming up close to a 50-50 basis. And of course, women are as likely to beat up their children as men are likely to beat up their children, and equally their elderly relatives or anyone else that they might have care for. So domestic violence goes in lots of different directions, and these days when same-sex couples are able to live much more openly than they were able to live back in the 1840s in Marx's lifetime, again the statistics suggest that the amount of violence that goes on between gay couples, between two men or two women, is no less than it is between heterosexual couples, and indeed in some of the research actually suggests it might be more. So it's not quite as clear-cut a perception as it once was. But is this a fair argument? The downtrodden man at a grotty job, or indeed the downtrodden woman at a grotty job, who comes home filled with rage and vents their spleen on their wife, their husband, their children, whoever it is that they got at home to vent their spleen upon. Valid view or not? Something we can discuss. The names you got listed at the bottom of the screen, Sylvia Frederici, Angela Davis, Margaret Benston, are examples of prominent Marxist feminist researchers, writers, and big names in the sociological arena. Should you want to go and look them up or get one of their books or what have you. That brings us on to postmodern feminism. Postmodern feminism is, to an extent, leaving behind the understandings of feminism from an earlier age, because it's postmodern, it's kind of shifting into the future, or at least what it perceives as the future. And it talks about a number of key areas, only some of which we have time to touch on here. One of them is this notion that women, historically at least, have been seen as the other, as odd, strange, peculiar. So when most doctors were men, they were writing about their experiences of their own bodily health, of their patients, but chiefly writing in terms of their understanding of what was normal for men, rather than necessarily what was normal for women. And that's something you can find going all the way back to the days of ancient Greece, and the notion that women's bodies were somehow a bit weird and peculiar, and that men's were much more sensible. much more sensible bodies, much more easily able for doctors to regulate a male body than to understand what on earth was going on with a female body. It becomes more overt when you look at psychiatry. Freud himself is rather famous or infamous for having said, woman, what does she want? What on earth does she want? I don't know, tearing his hair out, to understand female psychology. Are women, the way women think, the way women feel, the way women's bodies work, peculiar, weird and other? Well, if we're thinking in terms of percentages of population, obviously not. Half the population has one body, the other half has a different body, so it's an equal matched thing. If we're just thinking in terms of what's normal and what's unusual, clearly not. But the point of postmodern feminism, or at least the point it's trying to make here, is that the way social institutions think about women is as being somewhat peculiar creatures, because their de facto way of interpreting the world is from a male point of view. Even these days, when more women are working and so on, and in positions of authority, even institutions that are more egalitarian when it comes to the numbers of men and women who work there, may still be unwittingly operating from a de facto male point of view. Postmodernism feminism has a bit of an overlap with ecofeminism, which is an area of ecology and environmentalism which is focused on Mother Nature and the idea that nature has this feminine quality to it, in popular perception at least, and that women are closer in harmony and in tune with the natural world than men are. There's all sorts of other aspects to that we can discuss if that's an issue that interests you. We can talk about that in more depth in the chat. Standpoint theory you'll learn about again when you do the sociological methods module after Christmas, because it's quite a big thing in sociological methodologies. But it's the short version is that standpoint theory says that each person sees the world from their own angle, their own experience of life. My experience of life will be different from your experience of life and vice versa. And so we see the world from our own angle. And in order for an academic subject, like sociology or pretty much any other academic subject, to be truly well balanced and broad and well informed, you need lots of different types of people practicing it. So if we're talking about medicine, you need male doctors, female doctors, gay doctors, straight doctors, black doctors, Asian doctors, Chinese doctors, white doctors, etc., etc., etc. Because all of these different people will have different experiences of health, and what's healthy for one type of body might not be healthy for a different type of body. Different diets, different this, different that, different the other. And so if you have doctors from a very wide array of backgrounds, the overall understanding of medicine is they all write their journal articles and put in their research and write books and all the rest of it. It will build up an enormous body of medical knowledge that is much broader in its understanding of human health than you would if every single doctor was a middle-class white man, or for that matter, if every single doctor was a working-class black woman. In any direction, if you had only one type of person studying a subject, you would have a very limited view of that subject. So standpoint theory is partly about diversifying the number and types of people who study a subject to get lots of different viewpoints, but also the idea that if you're conducting interviews and so on, in sociology particularly, to find out someone else's experience of the world, what you really need to do is shut your trap and listen. Listen to what they say. Not put words in their mouth, not control their narrative, but to really allow them to describe the world from their point of view. Whether they're right or wrong is besides the point. It's trying to get their experience of the world as they see it. Not as you think they see it, not as you believe they ought to see it, but as they actually do see it, as they actually do experience it. Which has, to a point, been seen as a more left-wing approach, but actually there are some interesting counter-arguments made from a more right-wing, socially conservative stance, which do sit well, strangely enough, within a standpoint theory approach. And if that's an area that interests you, again, we can look at how different politics affect standpoint theory in different ways. But and again, if from a feminist point of view, if you want to know what a woman's experience of the world is, ask her, listen to her, allow her to define the world from her experience. It doesn't mean she's absolutely right in everything she says, but it's, in other words, it's a case of not having a man tell a woman what she's experiencing the world as, or what she ought to think, or what she ought to do, or what she ought to say, but rather just saying, look, I want to know, you tell me, and I will listen. That's the approach. And also, equally within women researching women, you could say, for example, a middle-class academic woman wanting to research the experience of working-class women. Again, it should be about listening to working-class women, not telling them in that terribly high-handed middle-class way that people have of what they ought to think, how they ought to live their lives, what they ought to do, but rather just, again, stop talking and just listen to what people actually have to say. That's what it's about. There is a questioning, and to some point, at least some extent, a rejection of positivism, which you will instantly remember, I'm sure, is that doctrine of hard science. Facts, experimentation, testing, retesting, provable, objective, neutral information about the world that's not biased one way or the other, but fact as a pure thing, science as a pure thing. The postmodern approach is to claim, rightly or wrongly, that there is no such thing as pure science, no such thing as pure knowledge, that all knowledge is developed by biased human beings and understood by other biased human beings who are reading the books written by the first bunch of human beings, and therefore all knowledge is situated, that's the term to use, situated in a social context and must be understood as such. Part and parcel of postmodernism is also this grasp of power relationships and dynamics. This is an area where it overlaps with Marxist feminism, which is also interested in these power relationships. That there are groups of people with a lot of power in society and other groups of people with much, much less power, very little power, and that the ones with power lorded over the ones without power. And in an ideal society, this would be torn down and things would be much more egalitarian. So again, is that kind of move to revolutionise the world. But all oppression should be understood as Group A dominating Group B. Whether we're talking men over women, or rich people over poor people, or in some parts of the world, white people over black people, and in other parts of the world, a different one, whichever ethnic group it is in that other part of the world, lording it over whoever they want to lord it over. So all of this is sort of understood as an abusive power dynamic. How do you tackle this? Because again, there's this idea that it's sociology not simply describing a problem, but trying to solve a problem, trying to change the world. Well, an element, at least, of how you go about changing the world is through opening up institutions, getting more diverse people in them. It's standpoint theory again. So getting different types of people on TV, getting different types of people writing books, getting different types of people as politicians, rather than the same type of person all the time. And all of this is heavily based on the assumption that if you are middle class, all middle class people think in one way. If you're black, all black people think in one way. If you're gay, all gay people think in one way. And a lot of people would severely question the truth of that perception. That can you make these broad swathed statements that, this is all run by white people, or this is all run by men, or this is all run by whoever, therefore it's stultified and dead because it lacks diversity, and that if you stick in someone from a different background, somehow they will automatically think differently and revolutionise the experience. If you're a postmodernist, then you'd probably say yes, they would. If you're not a postmodernist, you might question that. And again, we can discuss your stance, whether you feel postmodernist or not, as the case may be, during the discussion on virtual classrooms. Sort of pulling somewhat away from those areas, although this still overlaps a lot with the postmodernist approach, but it also to an extent does overlap with some of the other approaches as well. There are various theories developed in the study of media to do with how media works and how it shapes different power structures, in this case gender power structures, but you could equally apply it to other types of power structure as well. Cultivation theory is the idea that TV and films and mass media in general has what's termed a homogenizing power. That is to say, if we all watch the same programs, we'll all be immersed in the same views of the world because we've all seen the same stuff and come away with the same points of view. And so, especially these days now, practically everyone has a television, unlike maybe 60, 70 years ago, but mass media is much more of a thing these days than it was. Equally, you could say it's not just TV, it's social media, online sources, internet sources have a homogenizing, standardizing impact. A different point of view is the reflection hypothesis, which says that TV isn't making people have a shared culture, rather it's reflecting what they've already got anyway. So if we turn on a TV program and the husband goes to work and the wife stays at home and cooks the dinner, which could be a TV program or an advert or whatever, is that imposing a view of the world, or is it simply reflecting reality? That's the way it is. The reflection hypothesis says that TV, by and large, media of other sorts, mostly reflects reality. That's just the way things are. It's not making anything happen, it's just reflecting it. Role learning theory is a little bit more overlapping with cultivation theory, to a point at least, of saying, well, actually, no, media makes people absorb a version of reality. It, in effect, kind of creates reality by getting us to think that what we've seen on the screen is the way things ought to be, the only way things can be. So if little girls watch women on TV and they see them behaving in a certain way, will they internalise what they're seeing and grow up thinking that's the way they've got to be too? And equally, of course, little boys watching men on TV, will they grow up thinking that's the way they've got to be too? Whether that's real people or actors performing a role, or when I say real people, I mean documentaries, things like that. I appreciate that actors are actually real people, but I'm talking about seeing someone being themselves on TV versus seeing an actor playing a fictional character on TV. They both have a role learning aspect to take. The organisational theories approach does give some attention to who's on the screen, the actors and actresses and politicians giving talks on TV and that kind of blah, but it's also more, as much, if not indeed more, interested in behind the camera. So who's the director, who's the producer, who's the scriptwriter? The people, by and large, most of us don't get to see very often, but who create the shows, the films, the rest of it that we watch. Are they diverse? Or are they not? Are there women behind the camera? Are there black people, Asian people, Chinese people behind the camera, gay people, straight people, etc. behind the camera in positions of power, shaping the media, which would be both TV, keep saying camera there, but also newspapers, books, novels, all sorts of forms of media that we consume. Who is creating it, as well as the question of who is performing it? And what influence and clout do they have? So the wish for more egalitarianism. Now, as a task, you might want to again pause this, think about this, and then we'll chat more in the virtual classroom. Keeping the focus here on women rather than men. You might well have men. If the question is about men, you might have examples as well, but we'll keep it about women. If you're a woman yourself, or if you've got a daughter or a niece or some other female relative, who, particularly a young relative I'm thinking of here, who would you want them to look up to? Which figures in the media? So you might well say you want them to look up to Granny or the lady who lives next door, which is fair enough. But thinking of celebrities, well-known people in the media, and we'll include fictional characters in this as well as actual real people. Who would you want to push as a figure for them to look up to? And who, equally, would you be really worried if they were looking up to them and you think, oh my lord, what a terrible example that person is of what it is to be a woman? It'd be quite interesting to get your points of view on this. At some other occasion we can discuss which male role models you'd favour, but we'll keep the focus, as I say, on female role models here. And equally, if we're going to think about applying standpoint theory, with something we can discuss. So for the men in the class, how do you see the lives of women, the women in your life, female relatives, female friends, co-workers, next door neighbours, whatever, what you understand about their lives, but also from the women in the class, what they understand about their own lives. So, and that kind of contrast between the outside perspective, looking into someone, and the internal inside perspective as to how people understand their own lives. And of course you could apply this not just in terms of gender, but in all sorts of other ways as well. But we'll keep the focus on gender here. But have a think about it, so you've got a few ideas floating around in the back of your head, and then when we have the group chat we'll discuss it. Which thankfully brings me to the end, and I'm sure your ears will be giving thanks that I'm going to stop talking now. Next week, back to reality, back to being in the class and a real lecture. We'll look at Goffman and ideas around symbolic interactionism and the dramaturgical theory. Pick up a bit on the money issue again, and I will get round to uploading that additional PowerPoint on Simmel's views of money and so on. So I just haven't had the time to upload it yet. But it'll be uploaded before next week, so you'll have both that and the class angle to review and revisit that idea. And I know some of you have already been putting stuff up on the blog, which is fantastic. Please put more up. But we'll also provide a bit of support and guidance for anyone who's not sure either the practicalities of how to even get on the blog in the first place, or equally maybe you're not sure about what to write, what not to write, that sort of stuff. So we can go over some guidance in that area next week. But I'll stop talking now. Thank you for listening, and speak to you soon.